Do you really think you're qualified to touch a $500,000 necklace? I heard that sentence through the security system of the mall I own. The woman she said it to was my wife. The woman who has stood beside me for 43 years. She was wearing an old coat, simple, and a pair of discount shoes. The young lady behind the jewelry counter didn't know that. She also didn't know that this poorly dressed woman was about to become her future mother-in-law. 30 minutes later, that store no longer belonged to her. But this story didn't begin with money. It began with my silence. Before I tell you what happened next, take a second to subscribe so you don't miss family stories filled with tension and heart like this one. And leave me a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. I read every single message. Now, let me tell you why our 43rd anniversary turned into a night that changed our entire family. I've spent most of my life hearing unpleasant words in business, but when that sentence was aimed at my wife, inside a building that carries my name, it felt different. I didn't walk in right away. At 70 years old, you learn something important. Quick reactions usually make things worse. I stood in the operations room upstairs. The security screens were always on. Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock sharp. The mall was busy but orderly. No one knew that a small moment was about to reveal the character of several people. Susan had no idea I was watching her through the cameras. She told me she wanted to find a wedding gift for David on her own. She chose the most upscale jewelry store in the building, Luminous. I knew why. She has always believed a gift should be chosen by hand, not by bank account. She walked in carrying that old canvas bag she loves. No bodyguard, no assistant, nothing to suggest she was co-owner of the Grand Aurora. Melissa was behind the counter. I had met her a few times at family dinners. Each time, David kept my work life vague. He wanted to test the heart of the woman he loved. I respected that. I was poor once. I know what it feels like to be judged by your clothes. On the screen, I watched Susan pause in front of the glass case, displaying the diamond necklace Melissa had shown another customer just minutes earlier. After that customer left, Susan leaned down slightly to take a closer look. Melissa approached. I couldn't hear every word, but I could see her eyes. Her posture. Her hand rested on the display case lid before Susan could even finish speaking. The polite smile disappeared. In its place, a short, cold look. Susan said something. Maybe she asked the price. Maybe she simply wanted to see it closer. Melissa shook her head. Then she pointed toward the door. I zoomed in, not out of curiosity, but because I needed to be sure I wasn't misunderstanding. A security guard stepped into the frame. I recognized him. 2 years on the job, hard-working, young, still easily influenced by the tone of store staff. Susan didn't argue. She just stood there for a few seconds. I knew she was steadying herself. 43 years beside me has taught her never to cause a scene in public. When she turned to leave, it happened. No chaos, no violence. Just an awkward moment as the guard extended a hand to guide her and Susan lost her balance slightly. The silver bracelet I gave her the day David was born slipped from her wrist and fell onto the marble floor. The sound of metal touching stone was soft, but I heard it clearly. The old clasp broke. Susan bent down to pick it up. Melissa didn't step forward to help. She stood there with her arms crossed. Her mouth moved again. I didn't need to read her lips. I understood the attitude. Some people think luxury is measured by the distance they create from others. Susan held the broken bracelet in her hand and walked out quietly. She didn't know the entire mall management team could see it too. I hadn't ordered the cameras on. They are always recording. But the operations room grew unusually silent. I said nothing for nearly a minute. Then I asked the shift supervisor, "Who's managing that store today?" He answered, "Melissa Miller." That last name wasn't unfamiliar. I leaned back in my chair. I didn't feel anger the way young people describe it. No shouting, no fists on the table. Just a slow, cooling sensation in my chest. I thought about David. He's preparing for his formal engagement next month. He believes he has found a woman who understands family values. I replayed the footage one more time. By then, Susan had reached the main corridor of the mall. She stopped, took out a handkerchief, gently wiped her eyes. Not because she almost fell, but because she had been treated like someone who didn't deserve to step inside. At our age, we don't fear losing money. We fear being looked down on. I picked up the internal phone. Preserve all camera footage from Luminous between 1:45 and 2:30 this afternoon. No edits. My voice was steady. I stood and looked through the glass wall down at the main hall where Susan was walking slowly. Her back was straight. It always is. There's a paradox I've learned after decades in real estate. A store can lease my space, but it cannot lease the right to disrespect others. 30 minutes. That's how long it took from the moment Susan left that store to the moment I stepped into my private meeting room. I wasn't rushing. I was making a decision. Not for revenge, but to make one thing clear in this building: a person's value is not measured by the shoes they wear. And I wondered, if Melissa had known who the woman she pushed out really was, would she have behaved differently? Or does character remain the same, no matter who stands in front of you? I was still standing in the operations room when Susan turned into the east corridor of the mall. She didn't call me. That told me everything. When Susan goes quiet, it means she's holding on to the last piece of her dignity. I was about to go down to her. Then I noticed movement on another screen. In front of Luminous, a luxury car pulled up at the private drop-off. 3 people stepped out. I recognized Melissa, even without a clear view of her face. The way she lifted her chin, the way she laughed a little too loudly. The other 2 had to be Mr. and Mrs. Miller. They walked into the store, visibly excited. Melissa spoke quickly. All 3 of them glanced toward the entrance Susan had just walked through. Melissa's mother placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, then laughed. I couldn't hear the audio, but I've worked with people long enough to read gestures. That wasn't embarrassment. That was pride. A moment later, Melissa took out her phone. I assumed she was calling David. I didn't have to assume for long. My phone vibrated. "I'm here," I answered. "Dad," David said, a bit rushed. "Melissa just told me an older woman caused trouble at her store. Security had to escort her out." I looked at the screen again. The store was calm. No disturbance. No chaos. "Are you sure you heard the whole story?" I asked. David hesitated. "Melissa said the woman tried to touch a very expensive piece of jewelry without intending to buy it." I stayed quiet for a few seconds. My son was standing between 2 loyalties, and I knew which one he would choose. "David," I said slowly, "I want you to bring Melissa and her parents to Aurora Prime in 30 minutes. Now. I didn't explain. I ended the call before he could ask more. Downstairs, the Miller family left the store. They headed toward the elevator to the fine dining level. I knew what they were thinking. They believed it was a successful afternoon. They believed their daughter had demonstrated her standards. I left the operations room and took the private elevator down. Susan was sitting near the central fountain. The bracelet rested in her palm. I sat beside her. She didn't look at me right away. "I think maybe we should go home," she said softly. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" I asked. She took a deep breath. She didn't go into details. She didn't want me in the store. Maybe I didn't look like I belonged. I nodded. I didn't tell her I had seen everything. I didn't want her to feel watched. I simply placed my hand on her shoulder. "We're not going home," I said. That's when she looked at me. Not out of curiosity, but because she heard the change in my voice. We stood up together. No rush, no anger. Just 2 people who have lived long enough to know that silence can be stronger than argument. Meanwhile, upstairs, the Miller family had taken their table at Aurora Prime. I was informed they requested the one by the window overlooking the entire mall. They ordered wine before David arrived. David walked in about 10 minutes later. I watched through the restaurant cameras. He hugged Melissa, kissed her lightly on the cheek. She smiled, as if she had accomplished something admirable. I wondered if he knew the woman escorted out of that store was his own mother. Susan and I took the elevator up. When the doors opened, I could see their table from a distance. Mr. Miller was speaking loudly, gesturing as if telling a joke. I couldn't hear every word, but I saw him slap the table and say something that made Melissa laugh. Her mother shook her head with visible disdain. David sat between them. His face was slightly tense, but he tried to blend in. Susan and I entered the restaurant. None of them noticed us at first. A server greeted me by name. I nodded. As we approached the table, David looked up first. He stood abruptly. "Dad, Mom?" Melissa turned around. I looked directly into her eyes. This time there was no glass display between us, no camera as a buffer. It took her a few seconds to recognize Susan. I saw the shift in her expression. Not regret, Calculation. Let's sit, I said. No one laughed anymore. The mood at that table changed faster than the mall lights at closing time. Mr. Miller stood and extended his hand. You must be... I own this place, I replied calmly, and I am the husband of the woman your daughter asked to leave her store less than an hour ago. Silence settled over the table. Melissa glanced down at Susan's hand, resting lightly on the surface. The broken bracelet lay there, small but undeniable. David turned to her. You said it was a disruptive customer. I didn't interrupt. I wanted to hear her answer. Because sometimes, truth doesn't need to be forced. It reveals itself when people stand in front of the consequences of their own choices. And I knew. This dinner was only just beginning. Melissa didn't answer right away. She looked at David first, as if searching for a rescue signal. But David wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his mother. I didn't know she was your mom, Melissa said quietly. Her voice no longer sharp like before. Susan gave a small smile, not mocking. Just the smile of a woman who has heard that sentence too many times in her life. Do you think it would have been different? If you had known? She asked gently. That question made the air at the table grow heavier. Mr. Miller cleared his throat. This must be a misunderstanding. My daughter was just following store policy. I looked at him. Which policy allows someone to judge a customer by their clothes? He had no answer. Melissa jumped in quickly. I was protecting the merchandise. That piece is very expensive. How much? I asked. She hesitated. Around 500,000. I know the price, I said. I approved that inventory order myself. David turned to me. Dad, you watched the cameras. I nodded. I didn't add anything. The truth didn't need decoration. Susan placed the broken bracelet on the table. I wasn't planning to buy it, she said softly. I only wanted to look closer. Today is our 43rd wedding anniversary. David froze. I saw his shoulders shift slightly. He looked at his mother's hand, then at me. I didn't know, he whispered. That's right, I said. You didn't. Melissa tightened her grip on her wine glass. I can't know every customer's story. You don't need to know their story, Susan replied gently. Just remember, they're human. She didn't raise her voice. But David lowered his head. Silence stretched across the table. A server stood a few steps away, unsure whether to approach. I decided to end the waiting. David, I said, when were you planning to propose? Melissa reacted before he did. Dad, I asked because I've heard both families have discussed it. Mr. Miller forced a smile. We believe everything has been progressing very well. Progressing well, I repeated, by whose standard Melissa lifted her chin. What exactly are you implying I'm not implying? I said calmly. I'm observing. I turned to my son. Do you love her? David looked at Melissa. His eyes were more complicated than I had ever seen. The certainty he carried for months was no longer absolute. I think I do, he said. Love isn't, I think, Susan said softly. Melissa stood abruptly. I don't understand why you're turning something small into an interrogation. Small? I asked. She bit her lip. I was just doing my job. Your job is to sell jewelry, I said, not to sort human worth. Mr. Miller's patience was thinning. You're overreacting. I faced him. Have you ever asked yourself why your daughter believes a woman in an old coat isn't qualified to touch something expensive? That question wasn't just for Melissa anymore. It was for the whole family. Melissa's mother spoke for the first time. We raised her to maintain standards. Standards, Susan repeated quietly. Or distance. David stood up. He looked around the table, as if seeing each of us clearly for the first time. Melissa, he said, are you going to apologize to my mom? She looked at Susan. The confidence from earlier had faded, but pride was still there. If you felt offended, I'm sorry. Susan nodded slowly. You're not apologizing for what you did. You're apologizing for how I felt. That sentence cut through the last thread, holding this dinner together. David turned to me. What do you want, Dad? I looked at my son for a long moment. I saw the struggle in his eyes. Love against truth. I don't want anything for myself, I said. I want you to see clearly the person you plan to spend your life with. Melissa exhaled sharply. That's not fair. Life isn't fair, I replied. But it is consistent. The way we treat people, without advantage, reveals who we truly are. No one spoke for several seconds. Then David did something I didn't expect. He turned to Melissa. Can you go back to the store with me? She blinked. Why? To apologize properly. I didn't interfere. That had to be his decision. Melissa glanced at her parents. Mr. Miller shook his head very slightly. Almost invisible. But I saw it. She swallowed. Now, David said. Susan's hand rested lightly on my arm. I felt the faint tremor in her fingers. Not weakness. Hope. Melissa finally nodded. We all stood. As we walked out of Aurora Prime, the mall lights reflected across the marble floor like a wide mirror. Each of us could see ourselves in it, whether we wanted to or not. We moved toward the elevator. When the doors opened, I knew this wasn't just a ride down to the first floor. It was the moment that would decide whether my family would grow or quietly shrink forever. The elevator doors closed, reflecting 5 people standing side by side, yet not truly on the same side. David stood in front, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the floor, numbers counting down. Melissa stood close to him, but the distance between them now felt wider than 10 floors. Susan gently held my hand. She didn't need a public spectacle, but she did want her son to see the truth with his own eyes. When the doors opened on the first floor, the mall looked as bright as if nothing had happened. People walking, soft music playing, the scent of perfume drifting from nearby stores. Everything so normal. It almost felt ironic. We walked toward Luminous. The glass doors slid open. The evening staff looked up. The young woman at the register, the one whose words made me leave the operations room, froze when she saw us. Melissa slowed her steps. David didn't look at her. He stared straight at the display case where Susan had stood earlier. "This is the spot?" he asked. Susan nodded. Melissa took a deep breath and stepped forward. But something had changed. She no longer walked like someone who owned the room. She walked like someone asking permission to stand in it. The employee glanced at her. "What's going on?" Melissa turned to Susan. Hesitation was clear in her eyes. David spoke softly but firmly. "Go ahead." Melissa swallowed. "This afternoon, I behaved improperly toward you." No one interrupted. "I assumed you didn't intend to purchase anything, and I didn't give you the same opportunity I would give other customers." Her voice had softened, but it was still missing something understanding. Susan didn't respond right away. She stepped closer to the case and looked at a bracelet similar to the one that had broken. "Do you know why I wanted to see it?" Susan asked. Melissa shook her head. "Because I once had one like it. Not real diamonds, just a silver wedding gift. We bought it when we couldn't even pay the electric bill on time." David looked at me. "We kept it for 20 years, Susan continued. "Even after my husband's business stabilized. I didn't want to replace it. It reminded me where we started. The store grew quiet. I didn't touch that bracelet because of its price," she said. "I touched it because of memory." Melissa blinked several times. For the first time, I saw her defenses truly crack. "I'm sorry," she said again, her voice lower now. "I looked at you and only saw the coat." David turned to her. Not angry, disappointed. "Why?" he asked. That simple question left her silent. "Because in this environment, we're trained to read signals quickly," Melissa said. "Who's a serious buyer? Who's just browsing?" "Signals," I spoke. "Or prejudice." She didn't answer. One of the other employees quietly stepped back as if not wanting to stand too close to the center of truth. David moved forward, standing between Melissa and Susan. "Do you believe," he said slowly, "that if my mom weren't my mom, she would still deserve respect?" Melissa looked at him. This was no longer about work. It was about the future. "Yes," she said. "Then today you acted against that belief," David replied. I felt Susan's fingers tighten slightly around my hand. Not from pain, from emotion. Melissa turned to Susan. "Could you give me a chance to make this right?" Susan looked at her for a long moment. I knew she was thinking not for herself, but for our son. "Chance isn't something others hand you," she said gently. "It's something you rebuild through action." Melissa nodded. Tears shimmered in her eyes but didn't fall. David stepped back. The space between him and Melissa was clearer than ever. "Dad," he said without looking at me, "I need to talk to Melissa alone." I understood. Susan and I moved toward the entrance. Not far, just enough for them to face each other honestly. I watched my son speak quietly. Melissa shook her head a few times. Then she covered her mouth, as if realizing something difficult. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. But when David turned back toward us, I knew a decision had been made. "We're postponing the engagement," he said. "No drama, no anger, just fact." Melissa stood behind him, eyes red but composed. I need time to understand who I've become, she said softly. Susan stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that surprised even me. Recognizing it is the first step, she said. No applause, no grand declarations, just a quiet space where four people were relearning how to see one another. David hugged his mother. Longer than usual. I stood there, not as the owner of a shopping mall, but as a father who had just watched his son grow up in a matter of hours. When we left the store, the lights were still shining. But something had changed. Not ownership, not reputation, the true standard of our family. And this time, it wasn't decided by the price of a bracelet. We left the store in silence. No one won, no one lost. The truth simply lay there, on the polished marble floor, where the lights reflected like a giant mirror, forcing each of us to look at ourselves. Outside, David walked beside me, instead of beside Melissa. That said more than any explanation ever could. Susan gently held my hand. I knew she wasn't thinking about the insult. She was thinking about our son. As parents, sometimes, the deepest pain isn't being disrespected. It's watching your child stand in front of a difficult choice. Dad, David said as we stopped near the fountain. I'm sorry. I looked at him. Sorry for what? For not realizing. For believing the first version of the story without asking questions. I nodded. Trusting the person you love isn't wrong. Ignoring the truth is. Susan stepped forward and touched his cheek. You didn't ignore it. You faced it. David let out a long breath, like he was finally allowing himself to feel tired. A few steps behind us, Melissa stood alone. Her parents had already left the restaurant earlier. Pride can leave a room faster than disappointment. She walked toward us. I don't want this to end like this, she said quietly but clearly. But I also don't want to continue. If I haven't changed, no one answered immediately. David turned to her. I'm not ending us. I just don't want to build a future on a foundation we don't fully understand. She nodded. Her eyes were still red but calmer now. I grew up in a family that always talked about standards, she said. Today I realized standards aren't about what you own. They're about how you treat someone when you think they have nothing. Susan smiled gently. Some lessons arrive late for all of us. Melissa looked at her. Do you really believe I can change? Susan didn't respond right away. She studied the young woman in front of her, no longer the confident sales associate from earlier, but someone facing herself for the first time. I believe in action, Susan said softly. Not promises. Melissa nodded. Then I'll start there. She went back into Luminous and spoke to the evening manager. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw her remove her name tag, place it on the counter, and exchange a few short sentences. David watched closely. She quit, he asked. Temporarily, I replied. Some environments strengthen the worst in us more than the best. A few minutes later, Melissa returned. I'm applying for the mall's internal customer service training program, she said. I want to start over. I looked at her not as the owner of the building, but as a father measuring sincerity. That program isn't easy, I said. It begins at the customer assistance desk. You'll hear more complaints than compliments. I know, she answered. Maybe that's what I need. David looked at me. He wasn't begging. He was waiting for judgment. I nodded slowly. If you truly apply, I won't interfere. You'll be evaluated like everyone else. That's all I ask, she said. No rushed embrace. No dramatic reunion. Just a calm decision, more mature than any romantic promise. 3 months later, I stood behind the information desk of the mall, watching from a distance. Melissa was helping an elderly couple locate a lost handbag. She leaned forward, listening carefully to every detail they described. No impatience, no judgment. When the bag was found, the older woman held Melissa's hands in gratitude. Melissa smiled, not a sales smile, but the smile of someone who understands respect. Susan stood beside me. You see, I asked. She nodded. She doesn't look down at people anymore. David joined us. I invited her to dinner tonight. At Aurora Prime, I teased gently. He smiled. No, at the little place where you and Mom used to date. Susan let out a soft laugh. The table by the window still there. I already reserved it. I looked at my son, no longer a young man caught between love and truth, but a man who understands that real love requires growth. Dad, David said, if one day I propose again, will you and Mom come? Susan looked at me. I looked at her. We'll be there, I said. Not for the ring, for the journey. That evening, after the mall closed, Susan and I walked back past Luminous. The display case was still lit. The diamond bracelet still shimmered under the lights. I looked at her. "Do you still like it?" Susan smiled. "I like the old silver one better." I nodded. "Then we'll keep that memory." We walked away, hand in hand. 43 years ago, we began with a simple bracelet and the belief that respect is the foundation of everything. Today, after all of this, I understand one thing more clearly than ever. Money can build a shopping mall, but only the right values can build a family. And this time, our family didn't shrink. It grew stronger. If you believe a person's true worth isn't in what they wear, but in how they treat others, leave a like for this story. Subscribe so you don't miss more family dramas filled with hard lessons and moments that make us reflect. And if this story touched you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.